Dear listeners, welcome back to another brand new story, so let's dive in. I stood in the middle of our living room, arms crossed, feeling the suffocating weight of another argument pressing down on me. It was the same cycle, the same exhaustion, but this time something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just frustrated. I was done. I needed to understand what we had become. "You don't even try anymore," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's like none of this matters to you." She barely looked up from her phone, exhaling sharply, as if indulging me was a waste of her time. "Because it doesn't. Not in the way you think." Something in her tone made me pause. "What does that mean?" She finally met my eyes, her expression unreadable. "This marriage is just a contract." For a moment I stood there in silence, processing the weight of those words. A contract. Not a partnership. Not a union built on love. Just a transaction. Paperwork, signatures, obligations. "That's what you think?" I asked, keeping my composure. "That's all this is to you?" She shrugged as if my reaction was an overreaction. "What else would it be? We have responsibilities, bills, household duties, maintaining appearances. That's what marriage is." "You're acting like I said something shocking." She truly believed it. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It wasn't an emotional outburst. She meant every word. I should have been angry. I should have demanded to know how long she had felt this way. But instead I felt something else entirely. Clarity. For years I had convinced myself that our growing distance was just a phase, a byproduct of stress, routine, or life itself. That the love was still there, buried beneath the exhaustion, waiting to be revived. But that wasn't true, was it? She had never fought for this marriage because, to her, there was nothing worth fighting for. "Do you even love me?" I asked, knowing I wouldn't like the answer. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Why do you always ask these things? Love, feelings, passion. None of that is sustainable. People get married for stability, not fairy tales." Stability. That's all I had ever been to her, a predictable constant. A provider. The realization settled deep, colder than I expected. And yet, something inside me shifted. I nodded slowly. "All right." She frowned. "All right what?" "You're right," I said, watching her closely. "It is just a contract." She rolled her eyes. "Finally you understand." I let out a breath, steadying myself. "Yeah," I said. "I understand perfectly." She thought she had won. She thought the argument was over. That was her mistake. Because if this was just a contract, then I would treat it as such. And contracts can be terminated. I didn't bring it up again. I didn't argue. I didn't try to make her see the damage she had done with those words. Instead, I let them settle. I let them carve out every last illusion I had about our marriage. She thought I had finally accepted her version of reality, where love was a footnote and marriage was just a functional arrangement. In her mind, the fight was over. But in mine, the war had just begun. I started with the basics: legalities, finances, obligations. I wasn't about to walk away blind. The first thing I did was find a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in high-stakes divorces. Someone who understood leverage, control, and how to ensure a clean break with minimal damage on my end. I didn't tell her. There was no point. I wanted her to believe nothing had changed, that I was still the predictable, accommodating man she had always known. At night, while she scrolled through her phone in bed, I reviewed bank statements, property deeds, and every financial document tied to our names. I mapped out every shared asset, every liability. I identified weak spots, accounts she had access to, expenses she had taken control over. I studied her spending patterns, her habits, her dependencies. She thought she had control over this marriage. That was about to change. I also started to watch her, really watch her. Now that I knew the truth, everything made sense. The way she deflected deep conversations. The way she dismissed intimacy like it was an unnecessary chore. The way she made decisions without ever considering how I felt. For years, I had made excuses for her, convincing myself that love could be expressed in different ways. That some people just weren't affectionate. But now I saw it for what it was. She had never truly cared. At least, not in the way I had. One evening, she asked me to pick up something on my way home from work. A simple request, a routine interaction. And yet, for the first time, I saw it for what it was: transactional. No warmth. No gratitude. Just another obligation in the long list of tasks that made up her version of marriage. I did it, of course. I kept playing my part. But inside, I was already gone. I was no longer her husband. I was a man preparing to walk away. With my plan in motion, the facade of our life continued as if nothing had changed. The mundane rhythm of our days persisted. Meals shared in silence, weekends filled with obligatory errands, conversations limited to logistics and pleasantries. But with each passing day, my eyes were opened wider to the reality of what we had become. I started to examine the past with a new lens, dissecting moments that once seemed inconsequential but now revealed the cold truth. There were countless evenings when I would initiate conversations about our future, our dreams, our life together. She would nod along, her eyes glazed over, as if I were discussing the weather or the price of milk. When had my hopes and aspirations become so trivial to her? I remembered the nights I reached out for her, seeking the warmth and closeness that once defined us. Each time, her body would stiffen, her excuses rehearsed and mechanical. I'm tired. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. It's not the right time. The bed became a physical manifestation of our growing emotional chasm. Two people lying inches apart, yet separated by miles of indifference. Holidays and anniversaries became formalities rather than celebrations. I would plan evenings out, buy thoughtful gifts, cook her favorite meals. In return, I would get a perfunctory thank you or a distracted smile as she scrolled through her phone. The realization hit hard that these gestures, which I once believed nurtured our relationship, were nothing more than boxes to check off a list. I started noticing her demeanor when we were with friends or family. In public, she was charming, attentive, the perfect partner. She would laugh at my jokes, hold my hand, and lean into me as if we were still the couple everyone thought we were. But behind closed doors, the mask would drop. The affection evaporated, replaced by cold indifference or barely concealed irritation. It became clear that her affection was just another performance. A show for the outside world to maintain the illusion of a perfect marriage. Even in our disagreements, I saw it. The arguments were never about finding a resolution or understanding each other. They were tactical maneuvers designed to assert dominance, to remind me of my place in this so-called contract. If I tried to express hurt or vulnerability, she would dismiss it as overreaction, twisting the narrative until I began to question my own reality. Gaslighting, I realized. It had been her subtle weapon all along. The more I observed, the more patterns emerged. Her care was reserved for things that benefited her directly. Her career, her social circle, her hobbies. When I succeeded, it was met with lukewarm acknowledgement, a reminder not to outshine her. When I struggled, it was an inconvenience, a disruption to her carefully controlled environment. What stunned me most was how long I had been blind to it all. I had mistaken her practicality for partnership, her distance for independence, her manipulation for concern. The truth was, she had been crafting this narrative of a contract long before she ever voiced it aloud. In the quiet of our home, as she remained engrossed in her own world, I sat with these revelations, letting them seep into every corner of my mind. Each memory, each instance of her detachment, was another nail sealing the end of whatever we had once been. I wasn't just preparing legally and financially. I was fortifying my resolve, dismantling the emotional stronghold she had built around me. By the time I was ready to confront her, the love I once felt had eroded into a hardened resolve. This wasn't just a dissolution of marriage. It was a reclaiming of my own dignity, a refusal to remain a mere participant in her constructed contract. Every day, I watched her move through our life with the detached efficiency of a business executive managing a portfolio. And every day, I became more certain of the steps I needed to take. This contract, as she called it, was about to meet its end. Not in a court of law, but in the quiet dismantling of the lies that had kept it alive. I had spent weeks preparing. Every document was in place. The legal side of things was handled with precision, and I had made sure that when the time came, I would be in control. Not her. She had built this marriage into something transactional, stripped of emotion and meaning. Now I was about to show her what that really looked like. The moment had to be right. I needed her to be comfortable, unsuspecting. If I had learned anything from watching her all these years, it was that she never dealt well with losing control. I wanted her to feel it, to understand in the coldest, most practical way possible what it meant when a contract was no longer beneficial to both parties. So I waited. That evening, she was in the kitchen, casually scrolling through her phone as she leaned against the counter. The same detached posture, the same indifference she always carried at home. It was almost poetic, how unaware she was of what was about to happen. I placed the neatly stacked papers on the table between us. She didn't even look up at first. "What's that?" she asked, still focused on her screen. I pulled out a chair and sat down, my voice even. "It's what you wanted." She finally glanced at the papers, brow furrowing slightly. "What are you talking about?" You said this marriage was just a contract. I slid the documents toward her. I'm terminating it. Her fingers hesitated over her phone. And for the first time in a long time, I saw something other than indifference on her face. Confusion, maybe even unease. She set the phone down. Wait, what? I tapped the papers. Divorce, legal separation, division of assets. Everything's outlined. My tone was controlled, emotionless. I had a lawyer go through everything. It's fair, efficient. Just like a contract should be. She stared at me, searching for a sign that I was bluffing. But I wasn't. You already spoke to a lawyer? Her voice had lost its usual certainty. I did. There was a long silence. She flipped through the pages, scanning the terms. Bank accounts, property, debt, responsibilities. It was all accounted for. You're serious? It wasn't a question. I leaned forward slightly. Of course I'm serious. This is what you wanted, isn't it? A structured agreement. No unnecessary emotions. No romantic illusions. I tilted my head, watching her reaction. You made it clear. This was just a contract to you. I'm just making it official. Her jaw tightened. That's not. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You're overreacting. No, I corrected. I'm reacting accordingly. She sat back in her chair, arms crossed. And you expect me to just sign this? Just like that? I shrugged. It's up to you. We can handle this amicably or we can drag it through the courts. But either way this ends. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're really doing this? Yes. She picked up the papers again, but this time I saw it. The way her fingers clenched slightly at the edges. The way her expression had shifted from disbelief to something harder. This was the moment she realized she had lost control. She set the papers down, staring at me, trying to regain her footing. This is because you're angry. You're being spiteful. I shook my head. No, I'm just finally listening to you. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You're making a mistake. I stood up, pushing my chair back calmly. No, I said, looking her in the eye. The mistake was thinking this marriage was anything more than a transaction. I turned, leaving her sitting there, alone with the contract she had written long before I ever put it on paper. She didn't sign. Not right away. I had expected that. For someone who had spent years treating this marriage as a business deal, she suddenly found herself unwilling to accept the terms when they no longer favored her. Over the next few days, the silence in our house shifted. Before, it had been the kind of silence born from indifference, two people coexisting without connection. Now, it was thick with tension, charged with the weight of what was coming. She was calculating, strategizing. I could see it in the way she studied me, trying to gauge whether I was bluffing, whether she could still manipulate the situation in her favor. But she was playing a game she had already lost. It didn't take long for her to try the first angle, denial. One evening, she casually brought up weekend plans as if nothing had happened. We should probably get a reservation for dinner on Saturday, she said from across the room, her voice light, almost indifferent. I didn't even look up from my laptop. I won't be here on Saturday. She hesitated. What do you mean? I finally met her gaze. I meant what I said. This is happening. Her expression flickered briefly before she shrugged. You're being dramatic. I exhaled slowly, closing my laptop. Dramatic? I repeated. No, I'm being efficient. You, on the other hand, seem to be struggling with accepting your own logic. She crossed her arms. So you're just going to throw everything away? I shook my head. You already did. She had no response to that. The second angle came 2 days later, negotiation. She slid the papers back across the kitchen table, tapping her nails against the surface. These terms don't work for me, she said, her tone carefully controlled. I leaned back in my chair. They're fair. She scoffed. Fair? You think this is fair? Yes, I said simply. And if you don't, then we can let the lawyers handle it. But either way, this isn't up for discussion. Her jaw clenched. You're really going to do this the hard way? I gave her a long, measured look. There is no easy way. There's just the way things are. I could see the frustration building in her, the way she struggled to maintain the upper hand. She wasn't used to this. She had spent years believing she controlled the narrative, that I would always be the one bending, adapting, making things work. Not anymore. The third angle was the most predictable, blame. That night, she didn't try to be indifferent or rational. She was angry. You're a coward, she spat. You don't fight for anything. You just walk away when things get hard. I let out a humorless laugh. I fought for this marriage longer than you ever did. She shook her head, pacing the room. You're just trying to punish me. This isn't about the marriage. It's about your ego. I stood up slowly, making sure she understood that this conversation was already over. You told me what this was, I said, my voice steady. You made it clear. I'm just giving you exactly what you wanted. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out because we both knew the truth. She had spent years believing she could dictate the terms of our relationship, that I would always be there, no matter how much she withdrew, no matter how little she gave. She had been wrong. The negotiation was over. She didn't say anything when I started packing. No protests, no last-minute pleas, no attempts to stop me. She just stood there watching, arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral. But I knew better. She was processing it in real time, the moment she had always controlled slipping away from her. I moved methodically, taking only what was mine: clothes, personal documents, a few items that held meaning for me. I didn't rush, didn't slam drawers, didn't throw things into bags. This wasn't an escape. It was a decision executed with precision, just like she had always preferred things. She sat on the edge of the bed as I zipped up my suitcase. So that's it? She finally asked. I glanced at her, my hand tightening around the handle. What else is there to say? She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. You're really just walking away. I studied her for a moment, taking in the woman I had once loved, the one I had built a life with, the one I had spent years trying to understand. But now I saw her for who she really was, someone who had never been willing to give what she so easily took. You already left, I said, my voice even. I'm just catching up. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. I pulled my suitcase toward the door, pausing only once before stepping out. I turned to face her one last time, not with anger, not with resentment, but with finality. You were right, I told her. Marriage is just a contract. She stared at me, waiting for something else, some last-minute plea, some regret. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I walked out, and this time I wasn't coming back.